Welcome to this video seminar that is part of the 2021 National Conference of Sacred Music. I'm David Bone, Executive Director of the Fellowship of United Methodist in Music and Worship Arts. And joining me today is Mary Scifres. Mary is a speaker, teacher, and author that I've had the pleasure to work with on the United Methodist Music and Worship Planner and prepare an ecumenical music and worship planner. Mary, you and I have seen lots of technological changes in the last 28 years when we've been working together. Do you remember these? When we had to, we had to send these back and forth to each other, sometimes overnight if we were close to deadline. So I just, in this time when technology has become such a vital part of what we're doing with worship, it's just interesting to remember where we've come from. While my work is primarily with the fellowship, Mary is daily helping churches plan worship through her consulting work at maryscifres.com. So Mary's going to share a bit with us, and then we'll chat a bit about worship planning, especially in this post-pandemic era that we are about to, or hopefully about to, enter. So Mary?
Thanks, David. It's been really interesting to think through creative worship planning when we are in the midst of a pandemic and we don't have any idea what the post-pandemic world is going to look like. And when I'm talking with colleagues and friends and coaching clients about what help they need in their creative worship planning, what they first express to me is this complete sense of chaos. And the unknown seems to define our current situation. And where I have found some hope in that is to remember the story of human creation emerged from chaos. Creativity always emerges from chaos. Genesis chapter 1 is the story of a world in chaos. It was without form, it was void. The waters were threatening with total tumult and chaos, and God separated the waters. And at every step, God is creating order out of the chaos. And at each step, God determines it is good. And so I've been thinking about how many different times, even before the pandemic, some of the best worship creativity has emerged from chaos. On screen is a photo that a friend snapped when I was leading at a Fellowship of United Methodist and Music and Worship Arts event of the dance crew and the drama crew in one of their beautiful moments in worship. But what the photo doesn't capture are the 5 days of rehearsal before that, and the first day that was a total hot mess of chaos. These were kids who'd never met each other. They didn't know the director, and they weren't sure what his bizarre way of creating liturgical drama was. But out of that chaos, by the end of the week, when they were bringing this drama to us in worship and their dance moves to us, this creativity just inspired and almost overwhelmed us. And I am remembering it started out of chaos. And so one of the questions I often ask people now is to really name the chaos. And I would invite you, as you're viewing this webinar, to take a moment, even if you want to hit pause, to think through these two questions. If you have a journal or a notebook and you want to jot down some things, or if you're watching with your staff or with some colleagues, you might just hit pause and ask each other, what chaos is challenging you right now? Because the more I can name the chaos, the more that I can start to separate the waters of the chaos and begin to create some order out of it. But it helps to name it. And then once you've named the chaos, then you can begin discovering what creativity is calling you forward. And that gives me a lot of hope and help when I am creating worship or creating worship anew, or trying to figure out how to create online worship when last week we were meeting in person, or how to create in-person worship outdoors when last week we were only online. I have to have some way of naming the chaos and separating those tumultuous waters so that creativity can call me forward.
Mary, I'll jump in. There's chaos in the worship life at my church because our church was blown away in a tornado just before the pandemic hit. And there was an incredible worship service outside, sort of foretelling what was coming. And then we have not met in person since that day, since that tornado on March 3rd. So our space is literally in chaos, inaccessible. We are doing online services, but I think we're getting to a point where we have to sort of up our game. And I think everybody is in that position. No matter what you've been doing, we always have to be looking ahead to how can we do a little bit better? How can we do something new? I'm actually going to be talking to and with the church staff next week, and I don't have the answers. So I'm just going to use you for a little free consulting today. What kinds of things have you seen churches doing that can help to bring forth just the creativity? Because we have lots of creative people in our congregation, but we're just in a situation that's very unique to us right now.
Wow. Wow. You are in chaos in ways that are much more complex than the rest of us. So thanks for giving us some perspective. Most of us still have buildings standing, and but the buildings in and of themselves are both a burden and a gift. And so, for instance, one of my coaching clients has a big, old, aging downtown London, LA building. And her two worship musicians both work full-time 9-to-5 jobs. And they didn't want to have to be working on Saturdays for recording worship when LA closed down, which it has been closed down for most of the pandemic. So they needed a place where they could tape at night. But you know how those big old cavernous buildings are, the lighting was never meant for video or television. And so they tried the first few weeks of recording in the sanctuary. And those of us who were watching online would have to squint, like, I can't really see Lida and her two musicians because it's so dark in that sanctuary in the evening. But they have a beautiful outdoor memorial garden. And so they have created that memorial garden as a sanctuary, which is a beautiful tribute to the memorial garden and beautiful use of it. And through the summer, they had plenty of light to do outdoor worship. Yes, we are blessed to live in California. So we have long sunny days. Now, as winter has approached, they've discovered the need for lighting. And so then they've had to create and purchase the lighting stands and create a well-lit environment because they still need to tape at night. But that's one way in which the outdoor space was a better gift than the interior space. Another colleague, the exact opposite. When they recently did some drive-by pickups for the Advent season where they were handing out Christmas candles, they did worship outdoors, and it was really hard to see. Whereas their sanctuary is beautifully lit. It's a newer building, and their recording of worship always happens in the sanctuary. And they have a really adept organist in technology. He happened to be both an organ performance and computer science major. So I know, what are the odds?
Wow.
But the stories I can tell about this man who has built his own organ, I mean, he's just amazingly creative. But he quickly just upped their worship game right after they began recording worship last March by teaching everyone how to record their own videos at home or in the sanctuary. And then he, working his editing magic, would edit them into a final, beautifully finished product, because those were gifts that he had. And now he's also a school teacher. So he did warn his pastor, okay, I did this at the beginning of the pandemic because I had to, and I can do it through the summer. By the end of the summer, you'll need to hire a video editor, which they did by the end of the summer. But they've been able to create that same beautiful, seamless flow because of the gifts that they had of both a well-lit sanctuary and the technology available to them, as well as technology experts. Contrast that with another friend of mine who literally has been doing every single worship service with her iPhone and a little tiny tripod since this thing began, as has her musician. And they're the only two staff members at that church. And it's an older congregation. There's no one to help. So they record each piece of the worship separately, and they send the multiple links in a PDF document, and then sit on Zoom on Sunday mornings and talk with people about what people have watched, which links they've watched, and that kind of thing. So everybody's doing it a little differently, but I love how people are discovering the ways that work for them. And even adapting. I've noticed that through the fall and as winter approached, people decided to change how they were doing it. If it was now too burdensome or it wasn't creative enough, they've changed it up. And preachers are really different. I had one friend who'd always been an extemporaneous preacher, and he has found manuscript preaching with a clear outline has been life-giving to him. I have another colleague who's been just the opposite. She was always a very serious manuscript preacher, and now she does these 3 to 5 minute humorous, really almost homilies. And so there's not a right or a wrong way. It's a matter of letting the creativity that's calling you forward really integrate into the worship that you design and plan.
You're talking reminded me about how important just the visual element is. That's not been as important in the past. Our fellowship member, Rebecca Garrett Pace in Dallas, I've noticed she has started the altar table visuals that she does, which normally would face the congregation. She has turned that around.
Oh, wow.
And so when they, I'm assuming that when they're filming, they are filming into the sanctuary and not from the normal viewpoint of the sanctuary, the congregation, which I think just gives a different look. It lets people see the sanctuary, and because they're seeing that space, I'm sure it helps them feel a little more home in that space and not just seeing a little piece of the front. I've also seen a lot of fellowship members who are starting to film things at many different places around their facility.
Oh, beautiful.
And you know, if there's a window that does this or something really works better in the church library or somewhere, they're moving around so that they're creating interest with those backgrounds. So it's not just filming what's going on, a view like people would have had in the sanctuary. They're beginning to see a different approach, not just what the content is, but visually what's on the screen. And I think that becomes so much more important to us to think visually and how that is speaking.
Well, and even when we regather for whatever live gatherings are allowed, depending on your location and the status of the pandemic, I have a colleague in San Diego. For most of the pandemic, San Diego has also been shut down, but they are allowed to do live indoor worship in very small gatherings this winter. And so he designed a walk through the campus. They have a large campus, stations of the Nativity, as opposed to Stations of the Cross. And then one family unit at a time can be at a single station, while the others are at other stations throughout the building, so that people get to see and experience the fullness of their building when they get to return, or when they're viewing it. If it was a recorded worship, I could see totally recording Stations of the Cross this Lent in different places in your building or different areas of the sanctuary, to give that sense of connection to the sacred space that our people are yearning for.
Certainly.
And which brings me to kind of my next point. In the midst of all this chaos, there is a lot of despair. And sometimes despair can feel like a bad thing. But again, I'm going to go with that same contrast. In the way our God works is hope emerges from despair. Some of the most important prophetic teachings we have in Judeo-Christianity come to us from the time of the exile. And the Israelites were in such deep despair. And yet you have so many words of promise. I will write my law within their hearts. I will call you by name. You will plant trees and build houses. Swords will be beaten into plowshares. justice will roll down like ever-flowing streams. Some of our most beloved passages of scriptures, even the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, are written coming to us out of deep, deep despair. This particular picture on screen comes to me from my sister, Rebecca, who's sitting there with her son, Rich. And they, before this picture was taken back in 2008, in 2007, in November, they had lost her husband and his father to cancer. And they were in so much despair, they couldn't even put together a memorial service. And many of us have had experiences through this pandemic of wanting to create a memorial service and not being able to, or the type of memorial service we wanted to create just couldn't be created in the midst of this pandemic. And I always have been thinking back to what happened with my sister and her sons, and how when they couldn't create the memorial service in November because they were sad, and they just were in so much despair and really denial that they thought Steve was going to live long past the time that he lived. But the next June, when Steve's birthday came around, they decided to host his annual birthday picnic. And that became his memorial service, because by then they were finally ready to proclaim the resurrection. That hope had finally emerged out of despair. And as with the chaos and creativity, I think that that hope can emerge when we can first name the despair and claim it. Which brings me to the second series of questions I would invite you to look at, pause, and either write in your journal or talk with a friend about what despair is frightening you right now. Really name that. When we name it, we get power over it. The ancients knew this. This is why God could not be called God. Even Yahweh was not to be spoken. Because when we name something, when we name our despair, we get power over it. And only in naming it does some of that power that despair holds start to disperse. So then you can answer the question, what hope is tugging you forward? And hope is a really powerful gift in creating beautifully. We have to have some hope for our creativity to reemerge. So if you find yourself kind of stuck in a creative desert, like, wow, I got nothing here, I need an oasis, start by naming the despair that's frightening you, and then you can start discovering what hope is tugging you forward.
I listened to a TED talk recently. It was a woman, and she had a tragedy in her life and in her family, but she also studied how people endure. And I really liked, she said there are three sort of common things for people who endure, for people who have hope, who don't let the despair get them. One, they understand that stuff happens to everybody. You know, an awful thing has happened to me, but awful things happen to lots of people. So I'm not that unique. I'm just going to accept it or name it, like you say. The other thing is to be grateful, to establish a gratefulness in your life every day. What are you thankful for? And the third thing was to ask the question always, is this helpful or is this hurtful? So in applying those things, I can see applying those things to worship planning. We have to first name that despair, name this problem, accept where we are, accept that we're going to be here for a while, accept that things are not going to be the same, expect that we're going to have to hire a video editor for our church, accept just all kinds of things and be with it. And at the same time, to be thankful, because I call them gifts of the COVID. Every now and then, you know, we find something that I think, gosh, if I hadn't had to stay at home all of this time, I wouldn't have learned this about myself. I mean, I talked to someone yesterday who was going to seminary because he said, you know, I have been sitting at home too much, and the yearning within me came forward in this quieter time in my life, and I'm going to go to seminary. Wow. So be thankful for what this time can give us. And then I think to just as we look at worship moments, is this helping us? I know we don't think about worship things hurting us, but I think they can sometimes. And so what is really helping our folks move forward? Is it helpful for them to see just one spot in the church every week, just see the chancel area? Or is it really more helpful, as we were talking about earlier, to see different parts of the church, to know it's there, all is well, and we will be there again? So I just throw that out as a way to get from this despair piece.
I really appreciate that. And wow, what an inspiring attitude about how we endure. And it's interesting because I think we have to help hope along in the middle of all this, and we have to help each other along in the middle of all this. And I think your question about, is this helping or is this hurting, is a really important one when we're making worship decisions, because there has been some keeping up with the Joneses feeling amongst musicians and pastors in the middle of all this. And it's almost worse because we can watch each other on YouTube and Facebook and Vimeo. And then we start thinking, oh, well, maybe I should do what they're doing. They're really good at virtual choir. I guess I got to learn that technology. Or
I think, yeah, everybody is sort of cursing Eric Whitaker for ever thinking up virtual choir.
I know.
Because everybody that I've talked to that has pulled that together, that they do it because they want to, and it's so exciting on the worshiper end, but it is much more difficult than anyone knows.
Yeah, my son is a video editor, and even so, he works with that organist. He's the editor that they hired. He has to depend on the organist to help him with the virtual choirs, because even with a bachelor's degree in video and sound editing, the virtual choir final product is a little beyond him because he's not a musician. And it's really complicated. And one of the ways we can help hope along is to simplify. If you'll go to the next screen, David, I've got 3 initial things that I keep trying to tell people. This is the way to determine what's right for you and your team. And the first thing is simplify, simplify, simplify. This pandemic has gone a long time. And even when we have been able to get back together, and as we are getting back together more frequently as things get resolved, it's never going to be the same. And it would be very easy to make it even more complex when we get back together to try to do, oh, let's do a virtual choir and a live choir and live stream service and the pre-recorded and the weekly. No. Always freeing ourselves to just simplify, simplify, simplify. And how do you know which to simplify to? I think that first question, is this helping or is this hurting? Not just the worshipers, but those of you who are having to craft, design, and lead the worship service. And then as you're making those decisions, play to your strengths. If technology is your thing and you've got great musicians for whom technology is their thing and they've got good recording equipment, you've got good recording equipment, virtual choir probably makes sense. But if you have a giant cavernous sanctuary and musicians who are healthy and young enough to gather live and sing in 4 different corners of the sanctuary or play bells safely distanced on the chancel, go with live stream or pre-recorded from the sanctuary. Play to your strengths, not what's the strength of the neighbor down the street or your best friend who seems to be doing it better than you are. They're probably looking at you thinking you're doing it better than they are. And then get the resources you need, whether that's hiring that video editor, finding the book that works for you. One of the resources I think we are really underutilizing is borrowing from one another. I mean completely borrowing, saying, can you send me that MP4 file? I'm going to have your choir be the guest choir this week. We don't all have to do a virtual choir. I love it when somebody posts something on Facebook and says, you can just all use this. I'm like, oh, good. I have a choir anthem for this week. My musicians don't have to come up for one. I've done the same thing with preaching. When I need a substitute preacher, I go around and find who preached a good sermon last week. Can I use your sermon because I don't have one in me this week? And so that's another way to get the resources we need. But then, of course, you and I have resources too. So I thought I'd let you tell them about some of the written resources that we provide that might be helpful.
Sure. Well, like I said earlier, for 28 years, you and I have been working on the United Methodist Music and Worship Planner, which is geared primarily for United Methodist resources. But then there's an ecumenical version of that called Prepare that references, gosh, I think, what, 10 or 12 different hymnals now, denominational and non-denominational hymnals. And then we have, those have hymn suggestions, but also modern worship suggestions, anthems, solos, other ideas. So it's, I'm always very gratified, uh, very grateful when people tell me how much they use it. It's, someone said, you know, I don't tell my pastor that I have this book because it makes me look good. It's my secret weapon. So that's fine. So I think those are uh, very good helps for folks. Obviously, I think they're good. And then the Abingdon Worship Annuals that you and your spouse and many others work on writing for lectionary-based prayers and litanies. Those are very good helps, just out of the box things you can use right away.
Yes. Well, and speaking of out of the box, I also have a subscription resource that puts all of that together. It is more, I would say it's more modern worship than traditional worship. So it depends on your setting, whether or not the subscription works for you. My subscription site is marycifersministries.com. And that's where you can subscribe to Creative Worship Made Easy, which includes thematic-based worship. It is lectionary scriptures, but each season we have a theme for the season, and then a sermon series with titles, sermon starters, words for worship that are less formal than the ones that you get in the Abingdon Worship Annual, and then creative worship ideas, which include song lists that are more from pop music and the newest Christian music, more performance-based pieces, video clips, images, and then hands-on participatory ideas, which, as you can imagine, in the pandemic have been completely rewritten, but ways in which people can give hands and feet to whatever they're experiencing in worship, kind of in the lines of emerging worship. So that's Creative Worship Made Easy at marycifersministries.com. But we've also got a couple free resources that I thought would be nice to share with people today. One is a book that my spouse, BJ Bew, and I wrote called Is It Communion Sunday Already? And so we've got a part of that book free for all of you today on this webinar. You can see the address there, marycifers.simplero.com/communion book. And you can just sign up right there and download half of the book for free. And basically that half is all of the lectionary-based communion resources, everything you need so that each month the communion liturgy is unique to that particular month and that lectionary season. So really glad to offer that as one of many free offers that they'll be, you are able to have this week because of the webinar.
And anybody can be a part of the fellowship. We're a ecumenical organization, even though United Methodist is in our name. So if someone would like to try out a membership, they can go to umfellowship.org/invitation. Just enter a little bit of information and we'll set you up with a 6-month complimentary membership. And one of the pieces of that is this great fellowship Facebook community group where our folks are just sharing ideas on a daily basis. This past week, it's like, what are y'all doing for Ash Wednesday? And oh, what are you doing for baptism of the Lord? And then somebody's like, oh my gosh, y'all are thinking way out. I'm still like Christmas Eve, help. So there's a really good community there of folks helping each other that's available for fellowship members.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite go-tos when I'm really puzzling. And I love the way that people are so active there that I immediately get responses. Within minutes, I'll have a half a dozen ideas that kind of get me unstuck, which is so helpful. So, right. Yeah. So, so I hope you'll all visit umfellowship.org/invitation and join us for the next 6 months. I also have several written resources on Amazon. Is It Communion Sunday Already, which you can get the free half of with the free offer. We also have a new resource specifically written for worship at home. And the Lent 2021 edition should be available within just a few days of the day that this webinar airs. So you can find that at Cokesbury or at Amazon. And if you're already looking to Advent 2020, I guess you could get the Advent and Christmas 2020 edition, which we just finished, but it's written specifically for families and for churches that are trying to hold people together even as we worship at home. Each Sunday, there's a complete worship service from call to worship all the way to benediction and postlude. And then also a couple things that are not exactly traditional worship related, but just if you're looking for a great book study, Bible study, The Gospel According to Beauty and the Beast, A Story of Transformation, or if you're in wedding season and still trying to craft weddings in the midst of this pandemic, probably virtual or very small family gatherings. My husband has crafted both planning your LGBTQ wedding for same-sex marriage ceremonies and planning your wedding, words for your marriage ceremony. So would welcome you to visit us on our Amazon author pages and find any of those resources. And then as David mentioned, I'm also available. You can just reach right out to me. We'll have our contact information in a little bit, but you can reach out to my assistant and set an appointment for a free coaching session if you need help in getting your creativity going again. You'll see that I work in a lot of different arenas, but after 25 years as a local church pastor and church musician, I really have a lot of ideas and wisdom to share, but mostly I just help you pull out the wisdom that you have within you. You do have everything you need. A good coach just helps you rediscover that. So with that, I also want to add two more things to my ideas about how we can help hope along. Sometimes we forget these other two, and in this post-Christmas season, while you're watching this webinar, it's a good time to remember to set aside time to rest and renew. I'm kind of sad that Lent is early this year because I know it's breathing down your neck, and I would like to have given all church staffs a 6-week sabbatical after Christmas, but my guess is you didn't get that. But wherever you can get your rest and renewal, you may be working 7 days a week, and I'm not going to judge that. But I'm going to say, then find 7 minutes of renewal every hour. And if you can recraft your schedule so you can start getting a day off now and then, or better yet, 2 days off, all the better. But however you rest and renew, again, play to your strengths. We all have rest and renew in different ways. But that's also where you can lean on others to fill in the gaps when you need a vacation Sunday. I have been known to pull entire worship services and gift that to my congregation. Guess what? The church in downtown LA is our church today, and that's who we're worshiping with. And you didn't have to get in a car and drive there. So that's another way to get some rest and renewal. And then finally, I think it was Nancy Farrington on a fellowship webinar last month talked about how grateful she's been in the way in which not just her staff, but her entire congregation gift each other with grace. And I want to invite you not just to gift others with grace, but lean on grace. I know some of you are serving in congregations that are not full of grace and mercy, and others of you are, and yet you feel guilty, like they shouldn't be so gracious and merciful. It's up to us to lean on grace and to really accept the gift that whoever we are and whatever we're offering, it is enough. Ultimately, God is the one who is crafting the worship services and expressing God's presence. We're just the vessels. And if we can remember that, it can be a little easier just to lean on grace and say, that solo might not have been my best offering, but it was my best for today. So that's enough. And that sermon may not have been exactly the way I wanted it, but it's the sermon I offered, and that is enough. And the more we can lean on grace, the more we can show others how they can lean on grace, because people are looking to their church leaders, to Christian leadership, to really help us see what grace means in a world that isn't offering a lot of grace. So that's my kind of helping hope along little hint there.
I think you are so right, especially on the rest and renew. I know in the fellowship for our members, we're really seeing the area where we need to up our game is in resources for self-care. And church professionals are, and even non-professionals are notorious for not doing a very good job with self-care. But how can we do that? And I would say, those of you that are participating in this National Conference for Sacred Music, some of you, your church has supported you in attending with finances before. So if those finances still exist this year, how might those be able to support you in some self-care, since you're getting this continuing education for free? I know we're last year, and probably in 2021, we'll have another 2-day prayer sabbatical retreat for folks that can be somewhat on site, but also online. And the online version, last summer, we had a member who just said, got okay from her church and found out to her church. She went to a nearby town, checked into a motel, and just gave herself a little bit of just quiet space for those 2 days to work with that online retreat. So being creative about how we do that and help ourselves, I think, can be very, 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 very helpful to people.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. We have resources. Again, our resources are different from place to place, but really depending on one another, which would be, I guess, another hint, depend on your colleagues, turn to others for support. David and I are available to you, as is the fellowship. You'll see our contact information there on screen. One of the other gifts I would like to offer to you is a free 1-hour coaching session. And if you want to just come and brainstorm how in the world you can get rest and renewal, that could be a coaching session enough. One of my favorite aspects of most of my coaching clients is within a year, they're getting 2 days off a week and 4 weeks off a year. So if we can figure out how you can get a few minutes off in a coaching session, or if you just want to brainstorm a worship question you have or some creative worship planning, would love to offer you that. You can just email my assistant, admin@maryscifres.com, and she'll get you right set up. I guess before we close, David, I would just say that this creativity and this hope that I've spoken of today are paths toward transformation. And transformation is at the heart of the sacred journey. It's a part of our Judeo-Christian heritage. It's part of the Abrahamic heritage. Abram became Abraham. Sarai became Sarah. And a little shepherd named David became king. And a little baby named Jesus became the risen Christ. Transformation is the heart and soul of who we are and who we're meant to be. But to get there, we have to make that choice. Choice is the first step toward transformation. And thinking back to that fellowship event at Lake Junaluska just, I think, 3 years ago, I'm remembering those amazing dancers and actors in the dance and drama teams and realizing the first step they took was they chose to attend a fellowship event. They chose to take a week away and take care of themselves and inspire their creativity. So whatever path forward you're looking toward, I just want to encourage you to make those choices that help you move forward. You have the power to make that first step toward transformation. When you take that first step, you begin your own path toward transformation. But just as I talked about, we had to name the despair to get to hope. We had to name the chaos to get to creativity. We also need to name our limitations that are making it hard for us to take that step forward. And thinking that Lent is just around the corner, and Lent is perhaps an ideal time to start your journey in a new way. I would encourage you, maybe your Lenten discipline this year is just to name the limitations that have been holding you back, or holding your people back, or holding your church back, or your choir back, or your orchestra back. What are those limitations? You may not be able to remove the limitations, but naming them helps you get honest about what strengths you can play to, and then what choice could move you forward. Even within our limitations, we have choices. David was a little dude when he had to face that giant Goliath, but he had a pocket full of stones and a great slingshot. And that was the only choice that could help him move forward. Other fighting choices weren't working for the Israelites, but a slingshot and a rock. And so our choices might be really simple ones, but if we can name those choices, it is really empowering, because we're facing a giant here, a giant of a pandemic, a giant of national unrest, a giant of just such an unknown future. in the reality that we were already facing an unknown future as church leaders, synagogue leaders, mosque leaders. We don't know what the future of organized religion is, and we didn't know that before the pandemic. We certainly don't know now. But even when facing those giants, we do have choices that can help us move forward. I'm curious, David, thinking back to your church and wow, I mean, the chaos that you were facing when the tornado tore apart your building. Um, how did you find some choices as a congregation to help you move forward and stay connected?
Um, there has been an effort to create lots of new small groups online. So we started first with groups which theoretically happened just after our worship service was online. So it was sort of the equivalent of chatting in the pews, because our church had quite a history of that. It was hard to get people to leave many Sundays because there was just so much visiting going on. It really, literally in the pews, because we didn't have any other gathering space. So we sort of tried to replicate that in connecting people with small groups. And frankly, I'm much more committed every week to that check-in with that small group than I am always to getting the worship service viewed at the appropriate time. Probably will view it later in the week. And now our staff has moved to creating a podcast with worship moments and sermons. So there's another way to engage with that content, but really keeping people connected outside of the worship moment has been really important to us. And just being sure that we all know that East End is still part of our life. So that's been really important as we've been doing that.
That's beautiful. And that is really important, to find those things that are connecting. And it's interesting, I'm hearing that in many, many places, that the sense of connection with one another is even more important than the connection with the building or even the connection with a specific worship time. We are created to live in community, from that second creation story when God created a mate, saying that humanity isn't meant to be alone. It's symbolic of the fact that God works through us, as Jesus says, where two or three are gathered. And so that community piece, even with musical groups, I have found that choirs that meet for social time and fellowship time are finding that really comforting and helpful, even if they can't meet and sing together. Or having a hymn sing where one person sings, everybody else is muted on Zoom, but you can see that you're singing together, can really bring kind of joy and energy back to our spirits and our souls, especially for those of us who are musicians and who are really lamenting the history of singing together and the synergy that creates. So making those choices to move forward in whatever small ways we can be very empowering.
And I guess it's a choice, but just in the discussion, I'm thinking that we all have to start looking ahead and understanding, gosh, we're going to be in a redevelopment mode. Every church is going to be. Someone that I've talked to was saying, talking to the people who deal with new church starts could be very important to us now, because every church is going to be a new church start when we start gathering again. There's going to be just an aspect of how are we incorporating people into this in-person moment again, especially when people are going to be, I kind of liked watching it in my pajamas at 9:38, and so we really have to work at that. And especially children's and youth choirs are going to be in a total rebuild mode.
Yeah.
And it's going to take us a good probably 10 years for us to regain that. But in a lot of places, those programs had been difficult, but maybe this is our chance to fill a void and to jump back in and re-energize those programs, or the entire music program of a church. What are we going to be looking at as we bring things back into physical space? How are we doing that to help people? And I think a big piece of that is going to be hospitality. And the kind of hospitality that new church starts are really great at, and that older, more established churches gave up. Just they don't have that conception. But that sense of hospitality is going to be, and community is going to be really important, because that's what you can't get online.
Right.
So looking for those things that are very unique to being gathered together is going to help people decide to come to church in their pajamas if that's what it takes.
If that's what it takes. Yes. Well, and I think, go.
No, that's all right. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think that hospitality piece is so critical to, again, the heart and soul of who we are within the Judeo-Christian tradition. We've always, that's what's defined us, is that we were the ones called to welcome the stranger, and God judges us when we don't. And it's interesting to think about what that hospitality means for churches that have begun reaching people who live thousands of miles away, who are continuing to reach people who may end up being homebound for the rest of their life, or home-centered anyway. And how do we keep connecting? So it's time now already to start thinking about how we will do the both and how we can really allow God to transform us into whatever this new beginning will be. It's a beautiful opportunity. And I want to talk about the tools for transformation, but before I do, I want to, you mentioned something about the power of music and our role. And I'm also aware that we have an economic crisis ahead that we haven't talked about as a nation and as a globe. But what tends to happen when there are economic crises is the arts get cut. And church has always been the one place where the arts are still standing. And so already thinking about, maybe your children's music program was in demise, and it might continue to be in demise. I can't say people are going to come flocking back to a children's music program, but if it gets cut in your public schools, if it gets cut in your community arts program, it could be that your small church children's choir is the only place where children are going to learn how to read music, learn how to sing a melody. So there may be a real opportunity for you to be of great service. And we'll just have to be open to where God opens opportunities, and we are called to serve. So, yeah. But that tools for transformation, I'll go over these quickly. I cover them very thoroughly in the Gospel According to Beauty and the Beast. But thinking about your church as a redevelopment, these tools can really help you, because redevelopment is transformation, and it begins with choice, but it continues because of having an open mind and an open heart. And that's something you could already be doing with your fellow leaders, with your sister and brother church members, is really developing that open mind and that open heart, embracing the changes that have already been a part of who you are, and embracing the changes we don't yet know. And that means self-awareness. All of those questions I had you ask, kind of the negative, what's your despair? What are your limitations? What's the chaos? That helps raise self-awareness. And I think as a congregation, we could be answering those same questions with honesty that allows us to start making room for transformation. And then, of course, hope, which has been a theme of today's webinar, love, which is at the heart and soul of our faith. And as David mentioned earlier, gratitude, which has an amazing fuel-like power to really inspire transformation. And then, as I mentioned earlier, help from others, depending on others, a companion on the journey, and the most important companion of all is God, who really creates transformation when we allow God to not just guide our journey, but to be in our journey every step of the way. Thank you, David, for inviting me to have this conversation with you today.
It's a gift of the COVID that we get to talk like this. I don't know that we would have gotten to do this if we weren't having to do it so I'm really, 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 really appreciative of it. If you, for any reason anybody wants the slide deck from today, they can email admin@maryscifres.com and get a hold of that. And here's our contact information another time, just to be sure that you have that. Anything else you want to say in closing, Mary?
Just thanks to all of you for staying in sacred music and continuing to lead and offer your gifts and keep music alive in our world in whatever ways you are able to do so, and to continue to offer worship and your creativity in that worship world. I know you probably don't hear from your people as often as you should, but I know that you are making a difference each and every time.
Yes, thank you to all, and look for that hope. And I believe we will all move through this time and it will come to an end. So
Amen.
thanks very much, Mary. Great to be with you.
Thanks, David.